When you try and explain certain topics, potentially a complex, abstract idea, it's often people will refer to the whiteboard. In other situations, you'd probably go for pen and paper. You might try to do something on the back of a fag packet. More exposure, more time at the whiteboard, more time drawing up your ideas and your thoughts on a whiteboard or even in a notebook. All of that is going to help.
Hello, Sales Nation. I'm Will Barron, host of the Salesman Podcast, the world's most downloaded B2B sales show. If you haven't already, make sure to click subscribe. And on this episode, we are talking whiteboards. That's why there's one right here. Where's the pen? I'm going to scribble on here so you can see it's just not just another big monitor. On today's episode, we have whiteboard strategy expert, Mark Edwards. He is a complete legend. I loved chatting with him. He's definitely going to be back on the show in the future. And he's sharing why whiteboards are the most persuasive tool that salespeople have access to. You can find out more about Mark over at whiteboardstrategies.co.uk. And with that, let's jump right into the conversation. So on today's episode, we're going to be getting into, for everyone watching on YouTube, whiteboarding, and for everyone listening on the podcast, iTunes, Android, and everywhere else. I'll direct you towards the YouTube to recap this show, because I'm sure
it would make sense.
There's going to be a distinct visual element to this one. But I want to get into your quote here of why the whiteboard is the greatest persuasion technology of all time. So, Mark, let's get into that to start, mate. Why is the whiteboard just so powerful in presenting and changing people's minds?
Yeah, I mean, there is no science behind this. That's the odd thing. I've kind of looked through the kind of journals on visual communication and so on. I can't seem to find any scientific evidence to prove the point. But if you go on YouTube, you will see, and yourself, you're included in this, Will, when you try and explain certain topics, potentially a complex, abstract idea, it's often people will refer to the whiteboard. In other situations, you'd probably go for pen and paper. You might try to do something on the back of a fag packet. But the likelihood is, in a business corporate environment, which is where I make my living, and I would have thought many of your listeners and viewers will be the same, going into customer offices, meeting customers, perhaps in their office or in a meeting room, you will find I would say 99% of the meeting rooms that are out there, the one piece of technology, and it's not much technology, but you'll see on the office wall is a classic £95 or $100 white laminate plastic whiteboard. And they are used over and over and over and over again. And in many respects, kind of overlooked, I think, by many of the professionals out there. So sometimes people will go for PowerPoint. They might take an iPad with them. But the reality is, if you get up and just start jotting down your ideas on the whiteboard, you'll make an imprint in the back of the customer's mind, because not only are they hearing you, they're seeing things as well. And I have a little exercise that I don't know if now would be a good time to kind of show you. Yeah. Again, it's something that I picked up a number of years ago. I can give a little bit of background. I was just in and out of a customer's office in the US, and I kept forgetting the PIN number to get in. Every time I'm a mid-50s-year-old man, there were a few times during the course of a day I needed to excuse myself, and I kept having to go back to reception to ask for the PIN number. And the receptionist said, "Oh, no. She was, because every time giving me the number, I'd be trying to remember. But basically, the receptionist took a Post-it note and a pen, and said this. So this is how to remember it. So I'm just drawing, for those who are listening, I've just drawn kind of, a 3x3 set of boxes there, meant to represent the entry code pad. Mm-hmm. You'd probably have a 0 down here, but let's just make it simple, 3x3. And the number was this. You get it? Mm-hmm. Okay, so the number was, Will?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 8.
4, 5, 8.
I'm having to get, I'd have to write out the numbers. I'm reading the numbers in my head and then having to calculate it. But if the numbers were on the squares, I'd obviously make sense.
4, 5, 8, 7.
Yeah.
Okay. No, then. So if I take that
I've
away,
just failed the first test, haven't I, Mark?
Yeah, well, not really, because I said, I think maybe is doing it here, because sometimes when you use video, you do get a reverse image. I hadn't really taken that into account. But if you then try and reconstruct what was those four numbers, you go back and you have a look at it, you'll be able to reconstruct and build 4, 5, 8, 7. So it leaves an imprint that a verbal kind of response just will not do. Additionally, not only have you got the verbal element, but if you're pitching in a customer's office, you're speaking to them about it, when you deliver your message, when you're standing at a whiteboard, you really get kind of integrated with it. And again, I'll refer, if I can, to a number of the kind of YouTube sales personalities that are out there, typically coming from the United States, but the Grant Cardones of the world, you'll often see, although he uses a piece of technology similar to what you've got in your studio, but he's often there rattling out numbers on a whiteboard, as would be Jordan Belfort. Same again, except Jordan seems to prefer to use a flip chart. There's a benefit to a flip chart in as much as you kind of turn the page and you haven't lost what you had previously written up. So when I did a lot of work in the training room, delivering training courses to salespeople, the flip chart was typically the more common piece of kit that you'd use in that setting, because you could start day 2 and you could go back and refer to what we'd done on day 1. You can't necessarily do that with the whiteboard. But still, both of them, I think, go to show that the concept or the dynamic of a presenter standing at a whiteboard or a flip chart, explaining something to an audience, and then illustrating their ideas visually on the whiteboard or flip chart at the same time is incredibly powerful. Incredibly powerful. And again, go back to how when you were in school, the authority figure of the teacher was at the front of the room, standing in front of, as it would have been back in my day, it was a blackboard, maybe a whiteboard in your day. But also there's elements, I think, tied into that we are used to. We're partly conditioned to receiving information from authority figures, are typically subject matter experts in the form of a teacher or a professor in a university. So when, as a salesperson, when you use the whiteboard in that kind of context, where you're standing at the whiteboard delivering a message, it also kind of taps in to that. You could say it's a subconscious kind of dynamic, but it is there. If you look into a room and there's somebody standing at a whiteboard and other people sitting down, you would typically assume that the person standing up is the subject matter expert and leading that session. So it's all of those things, Will, that feed into making it, in my opinion, the greatest piece of persuasion technology known to man.
So there seem to be 3 things I've jotted down here, Mark. So we'll run through each of them in order. The first thing is, and I found this really interesting, of how daft I just looked with your code kind of example. But I remember that shape. So the shape was. So if you
correct. Absolutely.
So I wasn't quick-witted enough to come up with the numbers in time without looking like a fool, but I'll remember that shape now. Next time we speak, that the shape will come to mind. So I guess there's multiple levels to this, and maybe it's how your brain. Although I think there is science that shows that our brains aren't particularly wired in different ways. It's a learning habits that people prefer numbers versus prefer images and that side of things, or audio cues. But clearly, I remembered it visually as opposed to kind of numerically, as perhaps other people would. And if there was a tone, obviously these keypads, when you key them in, sometimes they have a tone on them, like a dial pad on a phone, for that reason as well. And I guess for blind people to experiment with the buttons to get the right ones, maybe. I don't know. So there seems to be multiple layers to all of this that the whiteboard is hitting. Both the authority, the visual, the ability to, I guess, this is the second thing that I picked up on here. So tell me if I'm completely off on this, Mark. The second thing I picked up was it's almost like a shared memory that we've got on the board. So if you've got your short-term memory, which is processing everything as it comes at you, you've got your long-term memory, which you're trying to potentiate your short-term into. The whiteboard seems like an intermediary where you can have your ideas on it, I can input my ideas on it, and we can come up with a kind of a collaborative thought almost that can then be shared in our long-term memory.
Yeah.
So is that...
Most people,
go on.
I was going to say, with regards to the collaborative element there, again, my kind of specialism really is in the technology arena. So the typical clients are technology vendors, 90% of the time with a very much of a sales role and responsibility within an organization, but also we get a lot of pre-sales, sales engineers in. They typically don't regard themselves as salespeople, but they're involved in the sales process. They are more adept, I would say, and fluent in using whiteboards than most salespeople are, because they're used to kind of drawing up technology diagrams and so on and so forth. But when they have often said to me, when the customer, if they can get a customer up off their feet and they can pass the customer a pen and the customer starts adding information onto whatever it is that they've drawn on the whiteboard, a typical example would be where maybe they're drawing out a kind of their technology infrastructure, their wide area network. When the customer starts putting in their offices or some of their specific technologies in there, something else for you to consider here, then I would see that as that's the first time there was kind of ideas in the presenter's head, ideas in the audience's head, and for the first time they kind of come out into the physical world and merge on that whiteboard. So that co-creative element, most people would say that when that happens, there's a moment of magic. They intuit that, you know what I mean, that the relationship with that customer is now kind of rock solid. So it's not something that you'd probably want to build into the sales qualification process. Like, did your customer get up and whiteboard with you? Yes or no? If they did, we've got the deal. But most of the people who use this form and approach will know by long experience that actually it's very, very meaningful when the customer does that, because the customer ultimately, you could say, is kind of revealing themselves, showing you how they think. So there's all sorts of positives.
Well, it seems like it breaks down that barrier between the salesperson and the potential buyer, and the buyer's got their guard up because of how a lot of salespeople act and the way that media portrays salespeople as well. I think our audience is slightly different. Typically, it's more large deal size B2B sales as opposed to used car salespeople who are obviously notorious for using different weird manipulative techniques. So some of this may not apply so much to them, but it seems like it's a great opportunity to get, as you said, someone off their feet. And there's almost a social pressure, a peer pressure. I don't know if that's the right way to describe it, because that almost sounds manipulative. But there's a social pressure in the room when you ask someone a question for them to give you a response. Well, if you ask someone to say, can you share your thoughts on this? They almost have to jump in versus just giving you a kind of a one-line answer that they've pre-prepared.
You're a natural. You're seeing, say, one of the other elements that I've often referred to is that, say, if you consider that dynamic, if you put me as the salesperson, there's my customer, there's me, this is the salesperson, I refer to it as triangulation, in as much as we've got the whiteboard. It's not just me and the customer. And I ask some very probing, you might say challenging questions, but I'm able to do it for a number of reasons. One, I'm on my feet. Secondly, I'm writing the question up on the whiteboard. And I can look at the customer can look at me, the customer can look at the question on the whiteboard. But there's three of us here. It's not the two, and it diffuses the tension. If I can give you a short story. I sold many years ago, I was in IT sales back in the early 90s, and I sold a lot of desktop computers to a life insurance company. And one of the challenges that they had was that when life insurance salespeople, I don't know if you ever remember a guy maybe from the co-op or something would come, and they'd literally come into the kitchen of somebody's house, to collect their insurance premiums. But for these guys selling pensions, going into somebody's house and then asking them what they earned, what they had in saving, was, for a certain sector of the population, they'd take offense to it. You couldn't do it. But they had found, when using them in the US, they'd found that if the salesperson went in, sat up at the kitchen table with a little laptop, and on the laptop asked, what's your salary? What are your wages? What have you got in terms of savings or on deposit? They would give the answer because the answer was being fed into this. So I would see that as, again, a method of triangulation. The whiteboard is you, there's the customer, there's the whiteboard. It's not just the two of you interacting, and it does allow or enable a different form, I would say, you've got to be skilled at it, but a more effective method of communication, much more of a kind of, back and forth and collaborative communication.
Okay, so what is the first step then in, to use your term there, Mark, to become skilled in this? Because there's probably a lot of the audience going, okay, I get it. I'm sold. I'm going to follow up with Mark afterwards and get some training. But right now, what are the basic steps to implementing a whiteboard into a sales presentation, starting perhaps from the point of, I've been in sales 5 years, I'm doing reasonably well, right? And I use a PowerPoint presentation every time and I want to change things up. What would be the first step for someone in that kind of scenario?
Yeah, well, I say there are varying levels also of depth that you can go into. Where I am today, because I've been specializing in this area for 10 years. So what we do typically nowadays is I will go into an organization and they'll say, right, okay, this is our situation. This is whether it's a product or a new proposition that they want to take to market. This is the customer. We want our reps, our salespeople to be able to go in and hold a certain type of conversation and discussion. So we will typically design a presentation which can be delivered at a whiteboard. And if I was then, so let's kind of cut to the chase here so that your people maybe can actually do this for themselves. What would I be looking to do on a whiteboard? Effectively, I want to take the customer on some kind of journey. So it's going to be a story with a beginning and a middle and an end. Yeah. So if I give a basic structure here that perhaps your viewers and listeners, to give themselves just a little bit of a framework, a trellis upon which they can put their own proposition and their own solutions. Really, what we would typically start off with is the kind of current as is. So for a customer, where are you now? And a classic line that we would use here is if you're on your feet in front of your customer, kind of, and you basically want to introduce them to whatever your product offering is, you could start that by saying, well, look, the kind of things that we see in the marketplace when talking to organizations like yours, these are some of the issues and challenges that we have. And you could list them up. You don't necessarily have to draw anything too detailed and specific, but you can just list up, let's have a look at a couple of the 2 or 3 of the main challenges that we see in the marketplace today, and then present those to the customer. Having done that, then kind of pivot from there into, well, look, what are the kind of issues and challenges? What in terms of what are the complications and consequences of those concerns? So begin to map that out for the customer, checking off whilst you're doing this, by the way, Will, is this something that you see? If I say that this is an issue, this is an issue, and this is an issue, would you agree? Yeah. And you really, it's when at the whiteboard, you should be keeping your eye on what it is you're writing up here, but also all the while monitoring the audience, whether it's one person, 2 or 3 people, monitoring them to get some indication of what they're thinking. And the moment you see whether they're nodding in affirmation or you can kind of, sometimes you can see thoughts pass through people's minds. Make sure you involve them, bring them into the conversation at that point. So step 1, these are some of the issues that we see. Step 2, these are the typical results or the typical consequences of these issues and challenges. But hey, guess what, Mr. Customer? It doesn't have to be like that, because there is a solution. And at this point, then maybe draw up an abstract of your solution. So that doesn't necessarily, even in many respects, you might have, whether it's a piece of technology that you're selling, but maybe you should look to kind of draw an outline of your portfolio of services. So I'm just trying to think of an example here. Rather than a specific product, you might say, well, look, these are the various services that we offer. And an easy way of doing that, by the way, well, if I can, would just be to even put it into a grid format. Yeah. So, we've got 4 main categories of service. We do this, we do this, we do this, we do this. In each one of these areas, I can then list what those are. And of course, I can refer back to some of the problems that we talked about earlier on. And all the while doing this with the customer, looking for responses, looking for their engagement to get them involved in walking through this, say, this sequence, a kind of logical sequence, where at the end of it, you may, I think it's unlikely, certainly in today's business environment, you don't often get an opportunity to turn around and ask a customer for an order at the end of a meeting. When I started selling in 1986, selling photocopiers in the city of London, you could go to a first meeting, conduct a meeting, and at the end of it, literally close a deal and get the customer to sign an order there and then. It doesn't really happen nowadays. So I would conclude most whiteboard presentations with some kind of call to action. But that might be, a follow-up meeting is, to be honest, is probably the most common call to action. So how about we come back again, you get your people in the room, I'll bring some of my colleagues along and we'll kind of whiteboard it or workshop it out. You're looking for more engagement from a customer. It may be that the call to action is you want them to come and visit your showroom and maybe get a full demonstration, that type of thing. But it's usually some kind of progression in the sale, not necessarily a close. But that would be a basic structure. And again, just to hammer home that point, because you were very specific, what should they be doing? Say, look, just get up and use the whiteboard. Get up, start trying to articulate your thoughts visually in some way. And I said, this doesn't need to be artistic. It can just be, and often is, boxes with arrows connecting them. Yeah, but present your ideas in this way. And as I say, the more you're at your feet, the more time you spend at the whiteboard, the more comfortable you feel, typically the better you get.
So that's one side of it. Let's attack the other side here, and I'll give you an example from me using this whiteboard in our YouTube content, right?
Yeah.
How do we know, Mark, if we are completely overdoing it? And what I mean by that is, the example I'll give you is, on the first few times I used this, I started writing out questions and I was writing out text, and immediately I got a series of comments of, we don't need to see you write out stuff. It's YouTube. It isn't live. Cut that stuff out. They liked the idea of having, rather than an overlay, it was novel to have my handwriting on the screen. And since then I've pivoted, and I can share how I've pivoted. You can tell me if I'm right or wrong with this. But if you are going into your presentations, how do you know if what you're doing, I guess you're looking at the potential customers as you go through it, right?
You get better feedback. And it is the case, because a presentation, when I design them now, typically for maybe customers want, let's say, a 20-minute discussion, 20-minute presentation. Because again, if you go through those steps, this is where we are, this is where you want to get to, this is the kind of opportunity available to you and the solutions that we've got. It's going to take 15 to 20 minutes to deliver something like that. But you always have to be aware of the fact that, if it ain't going down, if it's not working, then you're just going to, I would say, pull the ejector cord and get out as quickly as you possibly can. That rarely, if ever, happens. Certainly in my situation, I've only ever really had maybe 2 meetings where I think I've been confronted by just nasty contrarian types who are just trying to be awkward. And I don't think there's anything I could have done in those situations. Otherwise, I've always found people very, very receptive to it. But you need to make whatever it is you're presenting. Again, the one thing I've learned over the 10-year period of just doing this is you need to make them simpler and simpler again and simpler again, and not be afraid of leaving lots of white space. So again, early on, I had customers, we designed a whiteboard and they go, you're not using that space there. You're not using it. They want to come up with some facts and figures or some proof statements but it was all getting too much. So simplicity, I think, is the key. Some of the things on your YouTube channel, there is a clip of you with is it an anxiety model that you've got, which is very good, by the way, which is classic example in mind. But if you think about it, it's a hugely complex situation, dynamic that you are trying to articulate there. And I think the model that you've got works really, really well. But what you were trying to do, or what you're trying to do, is you've got, I think it's probably a PowerPoint kind of flow chart diagram in the background, but you do insert yourself into it. There are points where you take your pen and you work on it. The challenge a lot of the time with the pre-formatted kind of Microsoft or PowerPoint elements is then that you can't necessarily read them. They're fine if you're reading a slide at close quarters, but actually if you stand back a little bit, and even that diagram that you had there, again, you and I are referring to something that you've probably got a picture of in your head, as I have.
I'll link to it in the show notes as well for everyone who wants to check it out.
Simply presented in live action. Didn't necessarily, even just with, say, with a block there, a block here. Here's the situation. Here's how you respond to it. I would just try and break it down, make it easier. Did it need to be 6 blocks? I think it was 6. Could it be broken down into 4? Make it as simple and as easy as possible. And also, don't be too fussy with regards to how messy it might look on the whiteboard. I mean, what we've got on the board behind us here, to somebody literally coming in halfway through this program and looking at it, they wouldn't be able to make any sense of it at all. But anybody who's heard my explanation as I've gone through it understands completely. So lots of opportunity. The merger of these two kinds of technologies is a challenge, but I think it's something that we're going to have to address, because particularly after this kind of now much more prevalent work from home scenario. I mean, I've worked from home for a very long time, but I've now conducted meetings and training sessions from my desktop, just using, I've got the whiteboard behind, but I also have a Wacom screen here where I can write on in front of me onto an application on here. But I think going forwards, I think there's going to be much greater use of of the digital technology, but we need to be able to find a way to get in there and personalize it, change it, adapt it, draw attention to certain elements. So you need to have, as you've used in the past, you need to have that pen and the ability to bring people's attention and focus to a particular point by drawing a circle around it or underlining it. So I hope that helps.
That does help. It seems like the audience might have a few light objections here, and I'm sure you get these all the time, Mark, of, I can't draw. My handwriting is terrible. One from me, which is a concern for me, I'm terrible at spelling, and I look like a right dick every time I misspell something on one of these YouTube videos. So is there any way to, I'm guessing none of them matter is the answer to the question, but is there any way to get someone who perhaps is really interested, they're really excited about this idea, but they have them as a hurdle that they've got to get over first? How do we get over those issues?
Yeah, I'd say, and I think the only way to get over them really is through continuous exposure to it. As I said, you might feel a little bit self-conscious. Even getting up and standing and using a whiteboard for some people is going to feel a little odd, as if they're drawing attention to themselves. Therefore, more exposure, more time at the whiteboard, more time drawing up your ideas and your thoughts on a whiteboard or even in a notebook. All of that is going to help. But I just want to hammer home that point. This is not about art or creativity here. There might be a situation, the type of things that I am typically drawing are squares, triangles, concentric circles, connecting lines. Yeah. Every now and again, I'm just trying to think what I would definitely, I use quite a lot of examples of, a person. So stick figures makes a lot of sense in many respects. But I don't end up drawing cars or horses, which would be very difficult to draw, even at the best of times. it shapes more than anything else. Okay. Now then, again, with regards to the kind of how neat your handwriting is, whether this is because I've been at it as long as I have, I just don't give a damn. I don't give a damn. And well, if I say whatever, if I'm saying this is category 2 and this regards to our solutions here, one of our challenges, in this area is we got too many vendors in this area. Okay, so way too many vendors. So what's necessary is we want some kind of vendor consolidation. Squiggle, squiggle, squiggle. But if it's been presented where I'm saying what the word is as I'm writing it up, it works. Nobody, or shouldn't, I tell you, not sure on the spelling of any of that stuff there. Vendors I'm comfortable with. Consolidation might be one of those words which in the middle, is it an O or is it an I? I know it is an I. But anyway, you can't read it. Nobody could come in from outside this call and look at that and have any idea what has been written. But if the two things are delivered at the same time, if the audience is receiving the visual and the audio together simultaneously, synced perfectly, by the way, in space and time, they understand. It locks in. So I think it's a case of just try and shed those inhibitions, get rid of the inhibitions, and get up and give it a go, and see how you develop.
So 2 things. We won't do it right now, but when we wrap up the show, we'll have a horse drawing competition, and I'll put that as the outro credits in the YouTube version of this podcast. But it seems like, Mark, that, and tell me if I'm right again here or wrong, I might be way off, we're communicating with our voice, and that is articulate. Hopefully that's articulate and straightforward. What we're writing on the board isn't necessarily, it doesn't have to be the exact word, it's more of a symbol, just to map out in space what we're saying. Is that how we should think about it, as opposed to a PowerPoint where the list has to be aligned and we look unprofessional if it's all over the place?
No, the more I'm talking to you, you're a natural at this. I mean, that's an insight that you're getting there. As you said, that it is, say, symbolic, even to the point there are times when I've even said to people, just bang, you know what I mean? It might be bang the whiteboard or underline something, big circles. It is suggestive of something, of importance, of criticality. So, all of that can be delivered at the whiteboard. As I said, it might just be literally taking a red pen, underlining something, or bang it, make it, raising the volume of your voice at the same time as doing it, hugely important. So with that in mind, you can begin to perhaps see we're playing the whiteboard now, and we're now getting into musical territory here now, which it is. We are beginning to maybe like a rim shot on a drum here, but we can play with the whiteboard and get all sorts of responses and dynamics out of it. So yes, absolutely. When it comes to a PowerPoint slide, as you said, we get fixated on, as I said, everything's got to line up correctly. It's got to be just right in the center. The font has got to be correct, the colors and so on. But bearing in mind that all of those things, with regards to the person who's putting it all together, it's a complete distraction from what the message is. You're spending all of your time thinking, how big should the font be? Where should it be positioned? And how long should my list be? And how neat and tidy should they be, formatted to the left or to the right or centered? Actually, if it's about the message, it can be quite messy. And what I've got here, and I could show you, I got, when I finish a development workshop with the customers, I will typically paste one wall with Magic Whiteboard. I don't know if you've ever seen Magic Whiteboard. Is the kind of roll-up stuff that you can paste on a wall, and it just looks, it's just one big wall of squiggles, lists, words, my work, other people's work. It just looks an absolute mess. But I would see it as the kind of creative endeavor, and what comes out of it once we've tidied it up, we've got something really meaningful and worthwhile.
Do you know what? As you say that, if you could meet with someone, I don't know, Bill Gates is top of mind at the moment with the pandemic that's going on, and he's being vocal about it. If you could meet with Bill Gates and document on a whiteboard the meeting that you had, that could be a really cool piece of art. Or if you meet, you met with someone, socially exceptional or an athlete, and you could pick their brains, and it was squiggles. That'd be a really interesting piece of art that I'm sure people would be interested in.
I'm sure they would. There is a again, if you look online, there's in terms of famous. It's not a whiteboard. It's on the back of a napkin. But the guy who basically set up Southwest Airlines in the US, it was supposedly, the apocryphal story is him in a bar with, again, a potential investor for his business idea, and it was back of a napkin stuff. So it was literally a napkin that you'd have in a bar, and it's a triangle, and on the three triangles, I can't remember, it's Dallas. Give me some others. It's Dallas, Austin, and one other kind of Texas kind of location, and it's just a triangle in the three locations, but that napkin is now referred to time and time again, certainly within the kind of the history of Southwest Airlines, but also when people do MBAs and whatever, when they study it, that napkin is absolutely referred to. So it is an artifact of that meeting, as even what you've got on the board there behind you. I mean, it's quite artistic what you got there, Will, to be honest, with that. But it is, if you think about it, it is an artifact. It is an image captured from a moment in time. I'm sure at the end of this call, you're just going to turn the monitor off and it'll disappear. But I would recommend maybe you take a screenshot of that and maybe color it in later. And
it's something, Mark, that we'll wrap up with this, mate. It's something that I've pondered. Maybe you can give me off camera some thoughts and feedback on this. I would love to document the podcast and almost me just sucking information from the guest and have it on the whiteboard. And with this, you can screenshot the page and it'll email it you. So I could put it in the show notes of the episode. I've pondered this, but I've never managed to. I've never tried it for a start. This was probably the episode to give it a go in. I've missed the boat there.
I'm interested what's on your notepad there, because the reality is it may just be words that you're putting down. I don't know whether when you take notes, whether you kind of write things out kind of longhand or whether you just put words down, which are going to trigger the thought. Also, if you look at my notebooks, I've always been a bit of a kind of, I wouldn't say I don't doodle at work, but even my ideas when they're coming out on paper, there'll be little squares and connecting boxes and so on. But what you've got there and is how you would work if, when I was kind of training people in a classroom again with a flip chart, ideas, whatever's coming from the audience, that would always be make a note, put it up on there. And I think you've got it in your notepad, but some of those points would be well served being written up on the whiteboard behind you there.
That is
but
really interesting.
Your concerns about your writing first.
Yeah, well, no one would be able to read it. So it wouldn't be an issue.
No, that's right. That's right.
But there's a triangle here from the Southwest Airlines story. I've written horse in capital letters with a big bubble around that. I've done a dotted line that goes from as is, consequences, solution, call to action, and then journey above it. So this, you're right. This seems like a great way to add another layer of, even if it's just for the people watching the show, another layer of engagement as opposed to anything else that come from that. I will experiment with this, Mark. I appreciate your feedback.
And say those visuals, because that says to me is that you're thinking visually as well. You're thinking in abstract terms. You're not just writing words down line by line. And particularly there with the sequence, you have basically dotted it into sequences. So that says that I do feel you might be a natural with regards to the whiteboard. But those elements, really, some of those refined, you can smarten them up, you can think it through. Maybe you can go, hang on a second, if I add this extra element to it, more importantly, and you put it on the whiteboard. Can I make a point here? I know we're kind of short on time, but think about, I mentioned there, the Grant Cardones of the world and you've seen him at a whiteboard. Typically he's numbers, $10,000 here, 1 point, whatever. And whatever. Jordan Belfort is more words. So he'll be writing up lists of words. Also, he likes to do kind of numbered lists. Yeah. So there's 4 main reasons behind this or something. Yeah? 4 reasons. He does 1. He does 2. He gets to 3. By the 4th one, he's forgotten what he's talking about. He's probably moved on to the next sheet by that time. But think of Robert Kiyosaki's book, Rich Dad, Poor Dad, which I'm assuming you're au fait with. You've probably come across it at some point. Conceptually, all right, think about it. It's a 4-box matrix. If you remember, it's kind of employee, self-employed, I think entrepreneur, business owner, and an investor. 4-box diagram. Stephen Covey with his 7 habits, he also had a 4-box diagram. Urgent, important. I don't know if you know the matrix. Urgent, important, not important, and not urgent. Simon Sinek, who is, I would say, a YouTube sensation at the moment. Very famous speech of his, which is all about, it's about the motivation, and it's about why we do things. 3 concentric circles. That's all it is. There's a why at the center. I think it's a what is the circle around that, and a how around that. So, go have a look at that. That's basically 3 words and 3 circles in what is a 20-minute presentation that's possibly had, I don't know, many millions of hits. So, as I say, there's many speakers out there that are already articulating their ideas, not just verbally, but visually as well. And I think what you've said, you're already clearly getting the idea that maybe it's something that could add a little extra to what it is that you do here. You've got the tools, and I would say you've got the nous as well to be able to do it. So I look forward to seeing it on some future episode.
Good. I appreciate that, Mark. Well, we'll have you back on, and you can perhaps you can even just critique me, or perhaps we can critique a previous episode where I've used it, or I've not really got any meetings in the diary, but I'd love to now, especially as we're all selling from home. We've got a sales training platform called salesman.org. I would love to, having had this conversation, do a Skype or Zoom meeting. This is usually there, and I'll bullet point the topics of conversation, but I won't do what we've just described to link things together. I would love to perhaps do a sales presentation. Perhaps the audience would enjoy this as well, to see me do a good or bad or fumble or win the deal, and then get you to critique it if you'd be interested in that.
My guess is your customer typically is a sales director for that situation, isn't it? For the I'm used to those people. I've spent half my life in rooms with those people. They respond really well to a whiteboard presentation and also, by the way, they respect it as a skill and a competency. If you can stand up and if you can deliver your value proposition on your feet at the whiteboard, that's something that they're very keen for their salespeople to do. They respect it, and whatever it is that your proposition is putting forward, we said whether it's online training delivered that way, it's going to have great effect. So yeah, be very pleased and very happy to help you do it. I did a lot of sales training in my past. I don't do so much of it now anymore. As I said, 10 years ago, I latched on to whiteboarding, and that's all I've really done since then. But be very happy to help and work with you on that, Will. I've really enjoyed our time here today, actually.
Well, I appreciate that.
Time. We've been on too long.
Well, we'll wrap things up, Mark. I appreciate that, Matt. I appreciate you, for everyone who has been blown away, as I have, from this content, and you're essentially the training you've given us today. Tell us where we can find out more about you and all the whiteboard training that you do.
Well, obviously, I can be found on LinkedIn, which I think is a platform of choice nowadays for that. My name is Mark Edwards. Company is Whiteboard Strategies. And so you'll be able to search and find me on LinkedIn. A website is whiteboardstrategies.co.uk. And there's some videos and bits and pieces on there that you can have a look at. But I'll extend the welcome. If anybody wants to reach out, if they've got any specific questions, find me on LinkedIn and direct message me on there, and we'll start up a conversation. Very happy to do that.
Good stuff. Well, I'll link to all that in the show notes to this episode over at salesman.org. And with that, Mark, I genuinely really appreciate your time. I thought it was a really interesting conversation. I want to thank you for joining us on the Salesman Podcast.
A pleasure. Thank you very much, Will.